November 1944, Strasbourg, France. An American tank battalion bivouacked near an ancient road. They came for rest. At 0317 hours, the sentries screamed. From the northern tree line emerged a column in perfect formation, armor gleaming in moonlight, eagle standards held high, 6,000 strong. But these soldiers wore sandals, carried gladius swords, spoke Latin. The 6th Legion of Rome had been dead for 1,500 years, yet every night they still marched home. The mud near Strasbourg stank of diesel and old death. Staff Sergeant Frank Kowalski stood beside his Sherman tank in the November darkness, watching his breath ghost white in the moonlight. The battalion had rolled into this field at dusk, 32 tanks settling into defensive positions along what the French liaison officer called an ancient Roman road. Kowalski couldn't see anything ancient about the rutted track cutting through the farmland, just more European mud that would freeze solid by morning. His crew sprawled on bedrolls beneath the tank's hull, too exhausted to care about the cold. They'd been fighting since the beaches in June, and every man wore exhaustion like a second skin. Kowalski was 32, old for a tank commander with a wife in Chicago who wrote letters he couldn't answer honestly. He'd commanded this Sherman since Normandy, 78 days of combat that felt like 78 years. His crew trusted him because he kept them alive through hedgerow hell and the Falaise Gap. Now they were supposed to rest, refit, and prepare for the push into Germany. Battalion had promised 3 days of maintenance and hot chow before they rolled east again. Kowalski lit a lucky strike and studied the tree line 200 yards north, where sentries from Baker Company walked their posts. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. Corporal James Martinez emerged from beneath the tank, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that only spread the filth around. The driver was lean and dark-skinned, a rancher's son from New Mexico who could coax another 100 miles from an engine everyone else had written off. "Transmission's making that sound again, Sarge," Martinez said quietly. "We push hard tomorrow. Something's gonna strip." "Battalion says 3 days maintenance," Kowalski replied. "You'll have time to tear her down proper." "If we got 3 days," Martinez glanced toward the tree line. "This place feel wrong to you?" Kowalski didn't answer immediately. The field sat in a shallow valley between wooded ridges, good defensive terrain if you ignored the fact that every approach was masked by trees. The French officer who'd guided them in, a nervous lieutenant named Dubois, had insisted they bivouac here specifically, claimed the old Roman road would support the tank's weight better than the surrounding fields. He'd also mentioned something about the 6th Legion, but his English was poor, and Kowalski had been too focused on defensive positions to press for details. The scream cut through the November night at 0317 hours. Kowalski was on his feet before his brain registered movement, Thompson's submachine gun in his hands, safety off. The sound came from the north perimeter, not a wounded man's scream, but something worse, something that carried pure terror instead of pain. Martinez rolled out from under the tank beside him. Private Robert O'Brien, their loader, sat up in his bedroll with wide Irish eyes. "Contact!" someone shouted from the tree line. "Movement north! Column approaching!" Kowalski's training took over. "O'Brien, get Lieutenant Winters. Martinez, mount up and start the engine. Schmidt, get battalion on the radio." He was already running toward the perimeter, Thompson ready, boots splashing through half-frozen mud. Other tank commanders were emerging from their positions, weapons drawn, calling for their crews. The battalion came alive in seconds. 40 years of peacetime National Guard training and 5 months of combat had made them good. The sentry who'd screamed was Private Eddie Kowalski from Cleveland, a kid who'd held his position through German counterattacks at Mortain without flinching. Now he stood 20 feet back from his post, M1 Garand held in shaking hands, staring at the northern tree line. "They're coming through," Kowalski whispered. "Jesus Christ, Sarge, they're coming right through." Kowalski moved to the sentry position and looked north. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows. The tree line stood dark and silent for maybe 10 seconds. Then Kowalski saw them. The column emerged from the woods in perfect formation, 3 abreast, moving with mechanical precision. Moonlight caught on metal, hundreds of points reflecting silver white. Shields, Kowalski's brain registered. Round shields and short swords and helmets with horsehair crests. The figures marched in absolute silence, except for the rhythmic crunch of footsteps that sounded wrong, too light, like men walking on hollow ground. "Hold fire!" Kowalski ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. "Everyone hold fire." The formation was 60 men wide and at least 100 deep. They advanced in centuries. Kowalski had read enough history to recognize Roman organization, with centurions visible by their transverse crests, standard bearers holding eagles and other symbols that caught moonlight like signal mirrors. The soldiers wore segmented armor that flexed as they moved, leather skirts reinforced with metal strips, sandals that should have been absurd in November mud, but somehow made sense on men who'd been dead for 1,500 years. Lieutenant David Winters reached the perimeter at a run, .45 automatic in hand, Battalion XO Captain Morrison right behind him. "Report!" Winters snapped. Kowalski pointed. The Roman column had covered half the distance between the tree line and the American positions, still moving in perfect formation. "Sir, I have no fucking idea what I'm reporting." Captain Morrison raised binoculars, tracked the formation for 5 seconds, then lowered them slowly. "That's not possible," he said in a Mississippi drawl that had thickened with stress. The Romans marched closer. Kowalski could see details now. The eagle standard at the column's head bore the letters LEG6, the 6th Legion, with smaller standards showing century designations. The soldiers' faces were visible in the moonlight, stern and weathered, some scarred, all staring straight ahead. None of them acknowledged the American tanks or the men gaping at them. They marched as if the Shermans were invisible, as if 1944 didn't exist. "Should we challenge them?" Winters asked, his voice uncertain. "Challenge a ghost army?" Morrison's laugh was brittle. "With what password?" The column's right flank would pass within 50 feet of Kowalski's position. He could hear them now, not voices but the whisper of equipment. Metal against metal, leather creaking, thousands of small sounds that added up to an army on the move. And beneath it, barely audible, a rhythmic chant in Latin. "Dextro, sinistro," a centurion's voice ordered. "Right, left, march, cadence from before Christ was born." Technician 5th grade. Henry Schmidt appeared at Kowalski's elbow, radio handset dangling from his neck. The German-American radio man's face was pale. "Battalion wants to know if we're in contact with enemy forces," Schmidt said mechanically. "Tell them negative," Morrison ordered. "Tell them we have unidentified personnel moving through sector. No hostile action." Schmidt stared at the captain. "Sir, those aren't personnel. Those are—" "That's what you tell battalion, technician." Morrison's voice had steel in it. "Unidentified personnel, nothing more." The Roman column drew even with the American position. Kowalski stood 10 feet from the marching formation, close enough to see the individual links in their chainmail, the designs painted on their shields, red wings, golden lightning bolts, unit insignia from an empire that fell while his ancestors were painting themselves blue in Polish forests. One soldier passed within arm's reach. Kowalski could have touched him. The Roman was young, maybe 20, with a scar through his left eyebrow and a gladius short sword at his hip. His eyes stared straight ahead, focused on some battlefield 15 centuries gone. Private O'Brien crossed himself and whispered an Irish prayer. Martinez stood beside Kowalski, his Catholic medallion clutched in one fist. "They're dead," the driver breathed. "Sarge, they're all dead men." "Yeah," Kowalski agreed. "Question is, do they know it?" The column took 11 minutes to pass. Kowalski counted 11 minutes of Romans marching in silence, thousands of them, perfectly formed, heading southeast along the ancient road. When the last century cleared the American position, Kowalski watched them continue toward the village of Strasbourg, 2 kilometers distant. The formation never wavered. No one broke ranks. No one looked back. They marched like soldiers with orders, heading for an engagement that ended before America was born. Lieutenant Dubois appeared from the village approach, driving a jeep too fast over rutted ground. He skidded to a stop beside Captain Morrison's position, scrambled out without turning off the engine. "You saw them," the French officer said. Not a question. "What the hell was that, Lieutenant?" Morrison demanded. Dubois lit a Gauloise cigarette with shaking hands. "The 6th Legion, Captain. The Legio 6 Ferrata, the Ironclad Legion. They've guarded this frontier since Emperor Tiberius posted them here in 20 AD. When war comes to Alsace, they march. Always they march." "That's bullshit," Morrison said flatly. "I don't believe in ghosts." "Belief is not required, Captain." Dubois gestured at the mud where the column had passed. "Look at the ground." Kowalski knelt and examined the earth. The tank tracks and boot prints from American soldiers were clearly visible, deep impressions in the half-frozen mud. But where the Roman column had marched, the ground showed different marks, hundreds of them, shallow indentations in perfect rows, the unmistakable pattern of caligae, Roman military sandals with hobnailed soles. Kowalski pressed his finger into one print. It was maybe a quarter-inch deep, as if made by men who weighed almost nothing. But the pattern was perfect, the hobnails clearly defined. "This happened before?" Morrison asked quietly. Dubois nodded. "In 1870, when the Prussians came. In 1914, when the Great War reached Strasbourg. In 1940, when the Germans occupied Alsace. Always when armies fight here, the 6th Legion marches. My grandfather saw them in 1914. He was a boy, tending sheep in these fields. The Legion passed through his flock, and the animals did not move, did not make sound, as if the Romans were not there, but he saw them. Everyone saw them." "Where do they go?" Kowalski asked. "To their camp 3 kilometers south, to their fortress that has not existed for 1,500 years. They march until dawn, then they are gone. But tomorrow night, if you remain here, they will march again. They always march while armies occupy their ground." Morrison looked at his assembled tank commanders. 20 men stood in a loose circle around the French officer, every one of them having witnessed the impossible. "Anyone talks about this outside the battalion, you'll face court-martial for spreading panic," the captain said. "As far as official reports go, we observed unidentified personnel moving through sector. Local civilians in period costume, possible resistance activity, nothing more. Clear?" The tank commanders nodded, but Kowalski saw the same expression on every face. You couldn't unsee what they'd witnessed. You couldn't explain away 1,500 dead Romans marching in formation. Schmidt approached with the radio handset. "Sir, Battalion S2 wants confirmation on that personnel sighting. They're asking if we need to investigate." Morrison took the handset. "Negative investigation required. Personnel were local civilians, assessed non-hostile, departed sector south. Request permission to maintain current defensive positions." He listened for 30 seconds, then signed off. "Battalion says hold position. Reconnaissance patrol at first light." The tank commanders dispersed to their crews. Kowalski walked back to his Sherman, where Martinez and O'Brien waited beside the idling engine. "We mounting guard, Sarge?" Martinez asked. "Regular rotation," Kowalski replied. 2-hour shifts, but nobody fires unless we get Germans in real uniforms." "What if the Romans come back?" O'Brien's voice was steady, but his hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "Then we watch them march," Kowalski said. "Same as tonight." The Romans returned at 0322 hours the following night. Kowalski was awake when the column emerged from the northern tree line, had been awake since 0200, despite exhaustion that made his bones ache. He'd positioned himself at the perimeter with Martinez and Schmidt, waiting. This time there was no screaming, no panic. The sentries simply called out contact and held position. The entire battalion knew what was coming. The formation was identical to the previous night, same width, same depth, same eagle standards catching moonlight. Kowalski counted sentries as they passed, 12 of them, full strength, 600 men per cohort for a total legion strength of roughly 6,000. But he only saw maybe 2,000 in the column, and he wondered where the rest were. Dead on some battlefield whose name nobody remembered, buried in mass graves beneath Strasbourg's modern streets? Or were they still marching somewhere else, trapped in their own eternal patrol? "They're exactly the same," Martinez whispered. "Same soldiers, same positions. Look at the centurion with the scar through his eyebrow. 3rd rank, 4th century. He passed right here last night." Kowalski had noticed the same thing. The young soldier with the facial scar, the standard bearer who held his eagle slightly tilted left, the older centurion who walked with a limp, all of them in identical positions to the previous night's march. "They're not just ghosts," Kowalski said slowly. "They're stuck, like a photograph playing over and over." Lieutenant Dubois had remained with the battalion, sleeping in the village and returning each night to observe the phenomenon. He stood beside Captain Morrison now, both men watching the column with binoculars. "Same route every night since Rome fell," Dubois said, "from the northern forest to their camp in the south, the fortress of Argentoratum, which your maps call Strasbourg. They built it to guard the Rhine frontier against Germanic tribes. 2 legions garrisoned here for 300 years. "What happened to them?" Morrison asked. "History is unclear. The frontier collapsed in the 5th century. Barbarian invasions, Roman civil wars, the empire crumbling. Perhaps the 6th Legion died defending the city. Perhaps they withdrew when Rome abandoned Gaul. The records are lost, but something keeps them marching, some duty they cannot abandon, even in death." Schmidt had his radio handset pressed to his ear, listening to battalion net traffic. "Sir, Able Company reports the same phenomenon at their position 2 clicks east. They've got Roman infantry moving through their lines, heading southeast on a different road." "Different cohorts," Dubois confirmed. "The fortress had multiple approach roads. You see only one column because you bivouac on one road, but all across Strasbourg tonight, if you know where to look, you see sentries marching home." Sergeant William Turner from Louisiana approached the perimeter, his drawl thick with suppressed emotion. "Captain, got a situation with some of the men. Johnson and Parker from 3rd Platoon are refusing to sleep near the road. Say they can hear voices at night, Latin voices calling orders." Morrison turned from watching the Roman column. "The phenomenon is visual only, Sergeant. There's no sound, except what we're imagining." "Sir, with respect, there is sound." Turner met the captain's eyes. "I hear it too. Quiet, like it's coming from underwater, but it's there. March cadence, officers calling formations, and something else, screaming way off in the distance, like a battle happening somewhere we can't see." Kowalski listened carefully. The column was 50 feet away now, marching in that perfect silence that wasn't quite silence. If he focused, filtered out the diesel engines and American voices and November wind, he could hear something underneath. A whisper of Latin commands, the creak of leather and metal. And yes, very faint, the sound of men dying. Not modern death, no gunfire, no explosions, but the wet clash of edged weapons, the screams of hand-to-hand combat from an age when killing required touching your enemy. "I hear it," Kowalski admitted. "Been hearing it since last night. Thought I was going crazy?" "You're not crazy, Sergeant." Dubois stubbed out his cigarette. "The phenomenon is stronger some nights than others. When the moon is full, when weather matches the night they died, whatever night that was, the manifestation becomes more complete. You hear their battle because they are still fighting it. Somewhere in time, the 6th Legion is still bleeding." Morrison's jaw tightened. "I'm putting this in my report to regiment. We need to move the battalion to a different bivouac area." "It will not help," Dubois said quietly. "All of Strasbourg is their ground. You cannot camp in Alsace during wartime without encountering them. My people have learned to simply coexist. The dead march their roads, we march ours. In 3 days, you will push east toward Germany, and you will forget what you saw here. But the 6th Legion will still be marching when your grandchildren fight their wars." On the 3rd night, Private O'Brien tried to touch one of the Romans. Kowalski saw it happen. The loader had been drinking, not drunk, but loose enough to convince himself that courage meant confronting the impossible. When the column passed, O'Brien stepped forward and reached for the young soldier with the scarred eyebrow, the one who marched in the same position every night. O'Brien's hand passed through the Roman's shoulder like passing through cold smoke. The loader stumbled, caught himself, stared at his hand. "Nothing," he whispered. "There's nothing there, Sarge. They're not real." But the young Roman soldier had flinched, just a fraction, a barely perceptible hitch in his step, as if he'd felt something brush past him in a world he couldn't see. His eyes remained fixed forward, but for one instant, Kowalski saw confusion flicker across the dead man's face. Then the expression smoothed, and the soldier continued marching, locked back into his eternal route. "Don't do that again," Kowalski ordered. "Whatever they are, they got a right to be left alone." "They're in our bivouac area," O'Brien protested. "We got a right to—" "We're in their bivouac area," Kowalski interrupted. "We've been here 3 days. They've been here 1,500 years. Show some respect." Martinez had been watching the exchange with dark eyes. "My grandmother saw something like this once," the driver said slowly. "Back in New Mexico, near the old Spanish missions. Conquistadors marching through the desert at midnight, still looking for gold 300 years after they died. She said you never touch the dead. You let them walk their road, and you walk yours, and everyone gets home safe." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," Dubois said from behind them. The French officer had appeared silently, as was his habit. "The dead are not malevolent, but they are not entirely harmless either. They exist in their time, we exist in ours. When the barriers thin, during war, during blood and violence, we can see each other. But we should not touch. Nothing good comes from trying to hold on to ghosts." The phenomenon escalated on the 4th night. The battalion was scheduled to move out at dawn, rolling east toward the Rhine and the German frontier. Kowalski had spent the day supervising maintenance, ensuring his Sherman was ready for combat. Martinez had finally torn down the transmission and found the problem: a cracked gear that could have failed catastrophically if they'd pushed hard. They'd requisitioned a replacement from battalion supply and spent 8 hours installing it. The tank was ready. The crew was ready. But Kowalski found himself reluctant to leave. At 03:15 hours, the Romans came. But this time, the column was larger. Kowalski counted 20 sentries instead of 12, and the formation included cavalry. Ghostly horses with spectral riders, their hooves making no sound as they cantered past. Supply wagons rolled in the rear, pulled by oxen that didn't exist, loaded with equipment that cast no shadow. The 6th Legion was marching in full strength, and this time they were wounded. Kowalski saw blood on their armor, saw soldiers limping, saw bandaged heads and arms in slings. The column still maintained formation, still marched in perfect order, but these were men coming back from battle instead of marching toward it. The centurions' faces showed exhaustion and loss. The standard-bearers held their eagles with grim determination, as if keeping the symbols upright required their last strength. "Mon Dieu," Dubois breathed, "I have never seen them like this, not in all the years, all the stories my family tells. This is not the garrison march. This is the 6th Legion in retreat." The young soldier with the scarred eyebrow marched in his usual position, but now Kowalski could see the wound that had killed him. A spear thrust through the abdomen, the shaft still protruding from his back. The boy's face was gray with blood loss and pain, but he kept marching, kept his place in formation, because that's what Roman discipline demanded. Dead for 15 centuries, and still following orders. "What battle?" Morrison asked quietly. "What did this to them?" "I do not know," Dubois admitted. "The frontier saw many battles, Alemanni invasions, Vandal raids, civil wars between Roman generals fighting for the purple. Perhaps they died defending Strasbourg. Perhaps they died far from home, trying to hold a frontier that could not be held. The empire fell slowly, Captain. The 6th Legion may have fought their last battle decades after Rome itself was sacked." Schmidt's radio crackled. "All stations, battalion net. Be advised, regiment reports civilian sightings across the Strasbourg sector. Multiple calls from villages reporting armed personnel in archaic uniforms. Local police are investigating." Dubois laughed without humor. "The police will find nothing. By dawn, the Legion will be gone, and tomorrow night they will march again, and the night after that. They marched when Julius Caesar conquered Gaul. They will march when men land on the moon. They are eternal, Captain. War makes them visible, but they never truly leave." The column's rear guard passed, walking wounded who could barely stand, supported by their brothers, still maintaining formation despite catastrophic injuries that would have killed them twice over if they weren't already dead. The last man in line was a centurion with a crushed skull, brain matter visible through the shattered bone, yet still walking, still leading his men home. Kowalski watched until the column disappeared into the southern darkness. The mud showed their tracks, thousands of shallow sandal prints heading toward a fortress that was now a French city, toward barracks that were now apartment buildings, toward an empire that was 1,500 years of dust. "Tomorrow we roll east," he said quietly, "and they'll still be here." "Yeah," Martinez agreed. "We fight our war, they fight theirs. Maybe in 1,500 years, some future soldier will see us marching. Sherman tanks rolling through his position at midnight, heading for a Germany that doesn't exist anymore." O'Brien crossed himself. "Jesus, don't say that. Don't even think it." But Kowalski wondered. The 6th Legion hadn't known they were doomed. They'd fought and marched and died believing they were defending Rome, eternal Rome, the city that would last forever. Now they were ghosts walking roads that bore different names, marching for an empire that was studied in history books written in languages Rome never knew existed. "Maybe that's what duty is," he said. "Marching even when the war is lost, even when nobody remembers why you're fighting." "That's not duty," Turner said from the darkness. "That's hell." Dawn came cold and gray on November 18th, 1944. Kowalski stood beside his Sherman while Martinez conducted final pre-combat checks, watching fog roll across the field where the 6th Legion had marched. The mud showed no trace of them now, just American boot prints and tank treads, the ordinary scars of a modern army preparing to move. But Kowalski knew the sandal prints had been there at 0400 hours. He'd checked personally, measured them with a ruler from his map case, sketched the hobnail pattern in his notebook. By 0530, the prints were gone, faded like they'd never existed. The battalion formed up in column at 0600 hours, 32 Shermans rolling east in tactical formation, heading for the Rhine bridges and the German frontier beyond. Kowalski's tank was fourth in line, C Company lead element, with Martinez driving smooth and steady despite the transmission they'd just rebuilt. O'Brien sat in the loader's position, rosary beads wrapped around his wrist under his gloves. Schmidt monitored the radio, relaying movement orders from battalion. Everything was normal. Everything was wrong. Lieutenant Dubois stood beside the road as the column passed, smoking a Gauloise in the morning cold. He raised his hand in salute as Kowalski's tank rolled by. Not an American salute, but something older, fist to chest, the gesture a Roman centurion might have used. Kowalski returned it without thinking and saw the French officer smile sadly before the fog swallowed him. They crossed the Roman road at 0615 hours, the ancient stones still visible beneath centuries of dirt and modern paving. Kowalski felt the tank shudder slightly as the treads passed over them, and for just an instant, he heard something beneath the diesel engine's roar. Latin voices calling cadence, the tramp of thousands of feet, the sound of an army that would never stop marching. Then they were past, rolling toward a different war, and the sounds faded behind them. The battalion reached the Rhine on November 23rd after 5 days of sporadic contact with German rear guards. They'd lost 3 Shermans to Panzerfausts and 1 to mechanical failure, but casualties had been light. The crew of the mechanical failure had bailed out safely and been reassigned to replacement tanks. The other 3 crews, 11 men total, were dead or missing. Kowalski tried not to think about whether they'd someday march as ghosts through some future army's bivouac area, forever trying to reach a Rhine they'd never cross. On the night of November 24th, while the battalion dug in along the western riverbank, Kowalski pulled guard duty from 0200 to 0400 hours. The moon was waning, but still bright enough to cast shadows across the German shore 200 yards distant. He stood in the turret of his Sherman, Thompson at ready, watching for movement. At 0317 hours, he checked his watch specifically, he heard the march cadence. It came from behind him, from the west, from France. Latin commands carried on the wind, barely audible over the Rhine's current. Kowalski turned and saw nothing but darkness and fog. But he heard them clearly now. Thousands of feet, armor creaking, horses snorting, wagon wheels turning. The 6th Legion was marching east, following the American army toward the frontier they'd died defending. "You hear that?" Martinez asked from the driver's position below. "Tell me I'm not crazy, Sarge." "You're not crazy," Kowalski confirmed. "They're still marching." "They following us?" "Maybe. Or maybe they've been marching this direction for 1,500 years and we just happen to be going the same way." Kowalski stared into the western darkness. Romans built roads that went everywhere. Probably one runs straight from Strasbourg to the Rhine. They'd march it every night on patrol, checking the frontier, making sure the barbarians stayed on the far side of the river. The sounds faded gradually, moving south along the riverbank, following some ancient patrol route that no longer appeared on any map. Kowalski listened until he couldn't hear them anymore, then lit a Lucky Strike and smoked it down to the filter while watching the German shore for actual enemies. The battalion crossed the Rhine on December the 3rd, 1944, rolling over a pontoon bridge engineers had thrown across under covering fire. The Shermans moved carefully, one at a time, the bridge swaying under 30 tons of steel. Kowalski held his breath until they reached the eastern bank. German territory now, the far side of the frontier the 6th Legion had spent 3 centuries defending. They bivouacked that night in a captured German town whose name Kowalski never learned. The civilians had fled or been evacuated, leaving empty houses that smelled of cabbage and fear. The battalion pulled the tanks into defensive positions around the town square, posted sentries, and tried to sleep. Kowalski couldn't. He sat in the turret of his Sherman, smoking cigarettes and watching the road that led west, back toward France and Strasbourg and the field where ghosts marched every night. At 0322 hours, the 6th Legion came. They appeared at the western edge of town, marching in formation, the eagle standards visible in moonlight. But they stopped at the town boundary. Kowalski watched the column halt as if they'd hit an invisible wall. The centurions called orders, the ranks dressed. And then, for the first time in 4 nights of watching, Kowalski saw the Romans break formation. They didn't advance into Germany. They turned south, following the Rhine's eastern bank, marching parallel to the river but never crossing away from it. The Legion was patrolling the frontier from the German side now, the side they'd spent centuries keeping barbarians on, and their formation showed confusion. Officers consulted. Standard-bearers looked to their centurions for guidance. The perfect discipline wavered, just slightly, as if the dead soldiers knew they'd crossed into territory they shouldn't occupy. "They can't go further," Schmidt said quietly. The radio man had climbed into the turret beside Kowalski. watching the ghostly column with wide eyes. The Rhine was their boundary. Everything west of the river was Rome. Everything east was enemy territory. They're not supposed to be here. Neither are we, Kowalski replied, but here we are anyway. The young soldier with the scarred eyebrow marched past, still in his usual position, still carrying the spear wound that had killed him. But tonight, his eyes moved, scanning the German houses, the American tanks, the changed world around him. For just an instant, his gaze met Kowalski's across 1,500 years, and the tank commander saw recognition there. The Roman knew he was out of place, knew the frontier had moved or collapsed or ceased to matter, knew his war was over but couldn't stop fighting it. Then the moment passed, and the soldier's eyes fixed forward again, and he marched south with his sentry, following the Rhine toward some garrison that would never exist again. The column took 13 minutes to pass this time, 2 minutes longer than in Strasbourg, as if the dead moved slower on foreign ground, as if crossing the Rhine had cost them something essential. When the last Roman disappeared into the southern darkness, Kowalski climbed down from the turret and found Captain Morrison standing beside the tank. "You saw them," the captain said, statement, not question. "Yes, sir. They followed us across, followed us into Germany." Morrison's voice carried wonder and horror in equal measure. 1,500 years dead, and they're still trying to do their job. "Maybe that's all any of us can do," Kowalski said. "Keep marching, keep following orders, even when the empire falls and nobody remembers why we're fighting." Morrison pulled out a flask, took a drink, offered it to Kowalski. The whiskey burned going down. "I'm putting in my report that we've observed unexplained phenomena in multiple locations," the captain said. "Regiment will think I'm crazy, but I'm documenting it anyway. 32 tank commanders and 160 crewmen witnessed the same thing. That's not mass hallucination. That's something real." "Will it matter?" Kowalski asked. "Probably not. They'll classify the report and file it somewhere it'll never see daylight. But someday, maybe 50 years from now, some historian will find it and know we told the truth." Morrison took his flask back. "That's all we can do, Sergeant. March our road and let the dead march theirs." The battalion pushed deeper into Germany over the following weeks. They fought at the Siegfried Line, the Hürtgen Forest, and finally the Ardennes when the Germans launched their winter offensive. Kowalski's crew survived all of it. Martinez kept the Sherman running through weather that killed other tanks. O'Brien never missed a shot. Schmidt kept communications flowing through chaos. They reached the Elbe River on April 23, 1945, and stopped. The Russians were on the far side. The war in Europe ended 2 weeks later. Kowalski never saw the 6th Legion again. But on certain nights during the advance through Germany, when the moon was right and the battalion bivouacked near ancient Roman roads, he heard them. March, cadence in Latin, the creak of armor, the sound of an empire that refused to die. Other crews reported similar experiences, ghosts marching through tank positions, ancient soldiers walking roads that led nowhere, the sound of battles that ended before their grandfathers were born. He made it home to Chicago in September 1945, kissed his wife on the platform at Union Station, and tried to become the man he'd been before the war. It didn't work. He'd seen too much, knew too much about the weight of duty and the persistence of the dead. At night sometimes he dreamed of the young Roman with the scarred eyebrow, still marching, still bleeding, still trying to defend a frontier that ceased to exist, while empires rose and fell around him. In 1962, Kowalski's son asked him what the war was like. They were sitting in the backyard on a summer evening, drinking beer, watching fireflies. Kowalski told him about the hedgerows and the Falaise Gap, and the crossing of the Rhine. He didn't mention the 6th Legion. Some truths were too strange to share, too heavy to pass down. Let the dead keep their secrets and the living keep theirs. But that night, lying in bed beside his sleeping wife, Kowalski wondered if the Romans were still marching, still following the roads they'd built, still patrolling frontiers that didn't exist, still doing their duty because duty was all they had left. He thought about the young soldier who died with a spear through his gut 1,500 years ago, and he hoped, quietly, privately, that someday the dead would be allowed to rest, that their wars would finally end and they could lay down their weapons and stop marching. He fell asleep hoping, but he knew better. Duty doesn't end with death. The 6th Legion would march until the roads themselves crumbled to dust and the memory of Rome faded from human knowledge. And maybe even then, they'd keep walking, ghosts of ghosts, the last echo of an empire that believed it would last forever.